Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. So a past video I did just a few days ago talked about the state of California and the 2026 governor's race, but a very interesting part of the poll did include an early look at 2028. And in this video I'm going to focus more on that and the 2028 presidential race thus far. So when you look in California, the new Emerson poll for August of 2025 showed what a 2028 election matchup would look like, and it showed that Governor of the state of California, Gavin Newsom, leads a Democratic primary with 23% of the vote, followed by former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg at 17% and Vice President Kamala Harris in third place at 11%, with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez at 9% in fourth place. Now, on the Republican side, it showed that J.D. Vance having 40% support to 10% in second place for RFK Jr. and 9% for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in third place. It shows that Governor Gavin Newsom holds a 44% job approval rating and 38% disapproval rating. If you were to do the subtraction there, overall it's plus 6 points for Gavin Newsom job approval in the state of California, whereas President Trump holds a 30% job approval to 58% disapproval, overall a negative 28% disapproval rating for President Trump. So I thought this was interesting because obviously when you talk about 2028, the early names that have come up thus far usually are Governor Gavin Newsom of California, former Vice President Kamala Harris, and Secretary of State Pete Buttigieg, or former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. Now, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's name also comes up a lot in the national conversation, but given that this poll was just among voters who live in the state of California, you would expect Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris to be starting out pretty high. But what's interesting is it seems that in this poll, at least, a lot more Democrats in California seem to think that Gavin Newsom is the better Democratic candidate to be the candidate in 2028, more so than Vice President Harris, who only has 11%. And that's very interesting because I think that plays into the overall trend that we're seeing at the national level, where Kamala Harris in the first few weeks and months after the 2024 election, it looked like Kamala Harris, if she decided to run again, had a commanding lead over the Democratic field. Now, at the time, I did mention that this was not a surprise, as typically after a presidential election happens, the losing candidate almost always starts out as the most likely candidate to be their party's nominee, again 4 years later, because essentially these polls that are very early on in the process and the cycle are essentially popularity contest polls, and it's the candidate that most people have heard of that the people support. So Kamala Harris was leading for really January, December, February, March, April, and then you started to see towards April and May, things start to change a little bit. A Data for Progress poll, where it did not include Kamala Harris, showed what the numbers were. In the poll that did include Kamala Harris from Atlas Intel, showed Pete Buttigieg leading over Harris by about 4%. The Data for Progress poll that did have Harris up had her up by 4 points over Pete Buttigieg in that poll. Now, as time went on, Harris still consistently led in a lot of these polls, but then it started to get more interesting, where Atlas Intel back in May had Buttigieg leading over Harris by about 16% or so. Emerson, in their poll in June, had Pete Buttigieg leading Harris 16 to 13%, with 23% undecided. Overton Insights does have Kamala Harris leading, though, when all the candidates are thrown in, as well as McLaughlin and Rasmussen reports. Now, Echelon Insights, again, has Harris up, but Atlas Intel, once again, has Pete Buttigieg up. It's very interesting, because you're starting to see a lot of change now, the 2028 Democratic side, even though we're still very early on. Obviously, it's only August of 2025, so this is going to change a lot of times from now to 2028, but it's already interesting to see that Kamala Harris's support has already seemed to taper off a bit. Now, depending on what the poll you're looking at, Kamala Harris is still leading, and on the Race to the White House website's polling average, Kamala Harris still currently leads at 21.1% to Pete Buttigieg's 17.4%, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's 11.9%, and Gavin Newsom, Governor of California's 12.7%. But this is an interesting conversation. 14.3% are currently saying other on that poll, and there's still a very decent or considerable amount of undecided vote remaining for the 2028 Democratic primary. But this poll in California in particular, it just really interests me. Because when you look at these early primary states right now, you think, okay, well, who's leading where? In California, one of the largest states in the country, the largest state by population in the United States, based on their polling average now, and this recent poll is a big factor in it, Gavin Newsom is now leading in California. And these have only been 3 states that currently have polling on the race to White House website in the polling averages: California, North Carolina, and Florida. Now, North Carolina, Pete Buttigieg is leading over Kamala Harris by about 4.8%, and this one, Newsom pulls third. In the state of Florida, Buttigieg leads with 23%, AOC is in second, Newsom's in third, and Kamala Harris, I don't even know if she was included in this one. But it's interesting to see that Newsom is leading in the state that he's currently governor of. Now, if Newsom were to run for president in 2028 and not win the state of California at the presidential primary, that would obviously be very humiliating for him, and he likely would not have a super strong chance at becoming the nominee if you do not win your own home state. But what is interesting is Kamala Harris was just the vice president of the United States for 4 years and was the Democratic nominee for president in 2024, and she's still polling third in her own home state behind the state's current governor, which does, at least to me, suggest there may be a little bit of a momentum shift on the Democratic side, where some of the Democratic voters that wanted Kamala Harris to run again in 2028 may now see some of their support shifting towards someone new, including the governor of the state, with Gavin Newsom now coming up to first. Because nationally, you haven't seen a lot of polls thus far that have Gavin Newsom in first. But in the state of California, at least, it seems Gavin Newsom, for now, is leading. Now, again, the average on the race to the White House has Newsom leading over Buttigieg by about 7 points, and then Harris is 11.6, AOC 9.1, Elizabeth Warren 5, Andy Beshear about 5, Josh Shapiro about 5 as well, and the rest of the candidates rounding out have less than 3%. So it's very interesting, and you can kind of see there's only been about 3 polls factored into this for the state of California, but Newsom started out with a little bit of a larger lead and went back down, being very close, and then Newsom's lead started to go back up a little bit with Buttigieg's numbers rising, but Harris and the average going from 15.3 down to 11.6. Now again, we're in August of 2025, so there's not really a ton to overreact to this about, other than the fact that it seems to be kind of getting consistent with what we've seen from national polling, which is that thus far, the Democrats, who seem more keen on re-electing Kamala Harris to be the nominee in 2028, that number seems to have shrunken a lot. And it confirms the Democratic primary is essentially wide open right now, and as we look at some of these other states, Kamala Harris is no longer the runaway frontrunner to be the Democratic candidate in 2028 if she decided to run. Now it looks more like we have a completely wide open race where the Democrats may be putting up someone like Gavin Newsom or Pete Buttigieg in 2028, other than the sure bet of Kamala Harris being the Democratic nominee again in 2028. And I just think that's very interesting, especially on the Republican side, where as long as Vice President J.D. Vance runs and the President Trump and the Trump administration are still well approved of by a lot of Republican voters, the primary is essentially locked up for 2028. If Vice President Vance decides to run, I think he pretty much has a very strong chance at winning. Now, there may be a few Republicans that decide to run against him in the primary. Maybe you'll see Ron DeSantis jump in, or perhaps some other candidates like RFK Jr., or maybe Vivek Ramaswamy or Nikki Haley or Ted Cruz maybe try and make another run for it, but J.D. Vance will likely win that primary without too much of an issue. So the Republicans' primaries, even though we're still a long ways away, as long as Vance runs, it's essentially set. The Democratic side is very wide open, and as time develops and over the next few years or so, it's going to be very interesting to watch how this develops at this current point in time where Kamala Harris is very barely leading over the Democrats nationally. In her home state, it seems the governor, Gavin Newsom, has now taken a lead over the vice president there. So this could be very interesting to watch. Now, I want to hear what you think, though, about all this. Leave your thoughts in the comment section down below about this video and about Gavin Newsom leading in this poll. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video.